Go ahead, Willard, you're on.
Okay, welcome everyone. I'm Willard Gingerich, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this launch of Ken's latest book, A Lover's Quarrel. That opening music, as probably some of you recognized, was from Glenn Lehman's Harmonies Workshop. Great God of Wonders, a great way to begin this conversation involving Mennonites and Mennonite traditions. Um, I'm pleased to say we're joined in this conversation by Richard Thomas, who many of you, of course, will recognize as the former superintendent of Lancaster Mennonite School and the moderator of Mennonite Church USA. So, Richard, maybe you could say hello.
Greetings from Lancaster County to all of you.
And Ken, you've kind of introduced yourself, but say hello.
All right. Well, thank you. I'm Ken, and greetings from California, Fremont, actually, where the weather is cool today, about 60 degrees, and the apricot trees are blooming, and life is good.
We'll see after this conversation. My name is Willard Gingerich. I am currently professor of English at Montclair State University in New Jersey, after a career in academic administration that began at the University of Texas, then at St. John's University in New York, and then now finally at Montclair State. I've been the dean of grad school. I've been vice provost for research and graduate studies, and now most recently provost and academic vice president. My work has largely been in American literature, Native American studies, but also contemporary poetry. Ken and I go way back. We knew each other first at EMC, where we were involved in some joint publication work together. We worked together on the Phoenix, the literary magazine, also on the yearbook, as I recall. And we should say, Ken, that just off as a kind of tipping of our hat, as it were, clearly the Lover's Quarrel demonstrates someone who has a lifelong habit of journal keeping. You couldn't do that book the way you did without the journal support that you depended on, and for some of your other work. And I think we should say that we both probably, and some others of us, owe that habit to Omer Eby, a professor that we had at LMS and later at EMC. So we thank Omer and remember him fondly. To the audience, we're going to I'll have a conversation with Ken first, then we're going to turn it over to Richard. Meanwhile, you are invited to submit questions in the chat if you wish, and I will try toward the end of our conversation to look into that collection and see if we can pick out a few questions that I can pass on to Ken when we get toward the end. So, without that, I'm going to launch directly into one thing I forgot to say. Ken and I shared another very important experience. We spent the summer of 1965 together on a wheat harvesting crew across 3 states in the Midwest. Got to know each other pretty well on that little experience. And then we went different directions. But Ken and I were in at the origins in some important ways. So, Ken, then let me turn directly to you. I wanted to ask a little bit about your experience in publication. Your first novel was published in 1974, and you didn't publish another novel for over 30 years.
Right.
Once you started republishing again, you then another novel in 2016, 7 years later, then another one 5 years later, the prize-winning story, and now the memoir. For those who haven't read the memoir and don't know some of the background, irreverent novels have a history in American literature of running into opposition. The famous phrase "banned in Boston" has become a cliche in American lit. Doesn't really happen anymore. But as recently as 1984, The Color Purple was banned, in Boston. Leaves of Grass was banned. Catcher in the Rye was banned. There were books that caused commotion in the culture that caused them to have special opposition and resistance. You found some of that as you were preparing this first novel about World War I and some divided experience in the Anabaptist community. Can you tell us a little bit about that story and then how that influenced your wandering in the wilderness for 30 years after that publication?
Okay, Willard, you're a fantastic MC. I'm so glad you're doing the job. And it's so glad, I want to be sure and tell you all that I'm thrilled to see you. I'm seeing the faces of people that I have known and loved for many years. And it's a real delight, sort of like heaven, you get to see all those folks. And the ones that you didn't want to see, well, they went elsewhere, right? Okay. So anyway, writers live just by way of kind of a intro to talking about writing. Writers live for their readers, um, and we want people to read the stuff that we wrote. I know that those of you who write identify with that. But what I discovered early on was, when I was in my 20s, young and naive, I believed that all you had to do was write a good book, and the world would recognize it as the best thing since sliced bread, and they would buy it. And what I discovered is that's not at all true. Writing is the easy part. Marketing is the tough part. Um, I read the story of the book of Jaws, if you know that movie Jaws, and how that became a bestseller. And it kind of, as a writer, it just was disappointing to read how books are manipulated by publishers in order to make them into bestsellers. But so thank you all for buying my book or reading it and joining here today. And I just want to say, if you have any ideas on how to market this book further, I'll be happy to Zoom meet with your book club or autograph copies or arrange special pricing for your church or whatever. So yeah, the Mennonite soldier. Growing up, I had never read any stories like my own story. I read lots and lots of books, but I just didn't read any stories about a close community of extended family and um, revolving around church. That was kind of our community. And then I went and saw the movie Fiddler on the Roof, and I said, that's that's it. That's it. That's the way our life was like that. Um, but then I ran away from the church for 10 years, and I didn't want any part of Mennonites or Christians or anything like that. And that story's in the book, how I came back. But when I came back, I really fell in love with the Mennonites again. And I decided to write my Grandpa Yoder's story. And that is told in chapter 18 of the book, if you want to read that. It's also told the story of what happened to Mennonite soldier and how it started out as Amish soldier and became Mennonite soldier is told by David Zerker, who was a Messiah College, it's a Brethren College professor. He wrote it up in Mennonite Quarterly Review, and he called his article "A Novel Conversion: The Fleeting Life of Amish Soldier." Um, so Mennonite soldier is kind of the retelling of Jesus' parable of the prodigal son in a World War I, 1917 context. It's available on Amazon. So I had about a year-long debate. There was a year-long debate between Herald Press, who published the book, and myself in one corner, and John Hostetler, the Dean of Amish Scholarship, and Pathway Publishers, the publishers for the Amish community in Ontario, in the other corner. And the Amish leaders, specifically led by John Hostetler, said they objected to Amish Soldier. I gave John a copy because I thought, he could help me with this. And he basically led an attempt to shut this book down. And their specifically objections were they objected to descriptions of Amish hoedowns, to the bishop in there who defended young people sowing their wild oats, and also to the Ira character who they felt was a hard-hearted legalist. Now, Herald Press defended me until Pathway Publishers and John Hostetler announced that they were going to boycott Herald Press products going forward if Herald published this book. And Pathway Publishers bought a lot of stuff from Herald Press. So the book publisher, Maynard Shetler, came to me and he said, "We can't publish Amish Soldier. Can't do it. Sorry about that." And I said, "All right." I had kind of anticipated this all along, that this was going to happen. I said, how about if I make the characters Mennonites instead? They said, "Can you do that?" I said, "Of course." Because in 1917, the Mennonites and Amish were not that different. Also, I knew, both my grandparents were Amish who had become Mennonites in their 20s, and my grandparents on the other side were Old Order Mennonites who drove buggies. So I felt I knew, sort of both cultures. And it took me about 2 weeks to convert these characters from Amish to Mennonites. The Lancaster New Era made the publication of Mennonite Soldier page one lead story of the newspaper in 1974, one issue. They were fascinated by the fact that here was a conscientious objector. It was still the Vietnam War was going on. Here was a conscientious objector. What do conscientious objectors think? What the kind of thinking do they have? But the bigger story caused the Mennonite Soldier story to land on the newspaper again a week later, front page, lead story. And the topic was that the story of how the Amish had pressured Herald Press and forced Herald Press to not to publish an Amish story. Well, you know what? This was fantastic for book sales. The Lancaster bookstore, John Schertzer, the bookstore manager, sold 1,000 copies in the first week. It was a hot commodity. A lot of newspapers, and we got a lot of reviews. In fact, ABC Movie of the Week contacted the book editor and said, we want to have a conversation about maybe making this into a movie. Well, they never did. So that was the end of that. But you know what, Willard, I don't regret the change. I don't regret that it became Mennonite Soldier. I'm sure I would have sold a lot more copies as Amish Soldier, but I think it has a lot more integrity as a Mennonite story. It was my story. So, but publishing fiction made Herald Press very cautious. 3 years later, I came back with another manuscript that eventually became the book He Flew Too High, which is also available on Amazon. It's a story of a church split, 1950s church split. And let me read to you what, I worked with the book editor who was so excited about Mennonite Soldier, but when he saw He Flew Too High, this is what he said: "Ken, we think highly of your literary abilities, but we don't feel He Flew Too High, which is a blend of Eastern Pennsylvania Mennonitism, charismatic intrigue, sex, and violence." Wow, that'll make everybody want to buy this book. "Will be appreciated or helpful to the Mennonites and evangelical markets we serve." That was it. They shut it down. And I couldn't sell it anywhere else either.
And that's the manuscript that went in the drawer for nearly 30 years.
That's right. It did.
It's interesting. I happen to be teaching a seminar on Emily Dickinson and Walt Whitman right now. You wouldn't believe how that story parallels in many ways Walt Whitman's attempts to get Leaves of Grass published by a series of successive publishers. Ended up publishing it himself. But he met a lot of opposition and found finally a publisher who was sympathetic to him. So you're in a good tradition, Ken.
Okay.
So how did you recover then and after that long period of fallow um, work in other areas, how did you recover your creative forces to bring that manuscript back and get it published in 2009?
Okay. Well, I wouldn't exactly call those years fallow,
Okay. As a
but
writer, perhaps,
as
but
a
I mean,
writer, they were
yeah.
fallow. But for myself, they were great years because my wife, Kathy, who passed away in 1997, um, Kathy and I moved to San Francisco, and I gave up my dream of writing. I really felt kind of like it was the end of my life. I just was so grieved over this whole thing. Um, but we bought a temporary recruiting firm in San Francisco financial district, and I was a recruiter for 30 years. And that I bought a new car and a house in in very tight Silicon Valley.
Mhm.
Put all three of my kids through good colleges, and
Certainly not fallow. I
not
stand
fallow.
corrected. Yeah.
All right, no,
Of
no,
course,
that's
it's all in
okay.
the book. It's all in the
Okay,
book.
okay. But anyway, after I went through and this is a whole nother story, but I went through a deep grief period after my wife passed away. And then I met this wonderful woman who's with us today in the rose-colored um, blouse, posing for us in her lovely elegance, Patricia. And Patricia encouraged me. Well, first of all, I sold my temporary agency to a NASDAQ traded firm, came out with lots of money, and asked myself, what else is there to do in life? And Patricia said, why don't you try writing again? So I signed up for the Mount Herman Writers Conference and went there and showed my stuff to the writers, and they felt like I still had my mojo, you know? Um, and I decided to write again. It took me a couple years, but that emerged in He Flew Too
Mhm.
High.
Mhm. And then the rest of it is history, as they say. So let me ask you a broader kind of question. Um, you're by definition an American writer. As we sit here, there's no way you can escape that identity.
Okay.
Are you a Mennonite writer in spite of your disestablishment and dismissal of your church relationship? Are you a Christian writer, or are you some combination of those?
Well, I write stories. So, when you write stories, your focus is on character and plot and
Right.
the voice of the character. And I don't anyway think about, is this going to come out a Mennonite story or a Christian story, anything else? Once you create a character, the character will speak in the book. And my wife is always puzzled why. She says, you started the story one way, but now you're changing the story. Why are you doing that? And I say, well, the characters changed it. They come to life and
Sure.
change things.
Sure.
So I started out life, I think I thought I was being a Mennonite was the big thing as a kid. That's who we were. And being a Christian, yeah, sort of was there, some understanding of that. Being an American was not at all a
Right.
priority for me. Being Mennonite, of course, we didn't pledge allegiance, we didn't salute the flag, we didn't march in the band, all that stuff. But then, today I would say I'm first of all a Christ follower and then an American,
Mhm.
and then maybe a Jack Mennonite. You're familiar with
Mhm.
that term. They're Jack Mormons. Well, I'm a
Mhm.
Jack Mennonite.
And yet, the fact of the matter is that every one of these novels have something quintessentially to say about the American experience that, looked at from 10,000 feet, perhaps, um, they are American novels, and they certainly do rise to a level of resonance in the American culture, which, of course, the Mennonites have been very, very much an essential part of, in very interesting ways, I think, which is some of the reasons that particularly Mennonite Soldier, as you pointed out, has resonated, has been widely circulated and used in classrooms and a number of other places. Well, I'll have just one final question, and we're going to turn this over to Richard. Um, three of your four novels are historical. They're set in historical locales. And even your most recent one, the prize-winning story, is set in Israel, and in another contemporary, but in another locale. Is there anything unique? What are the freedoms and restrictions that you have to deal with? What are the freedoms that you're allowed, and what are the restrictions, constraints you have to observe in writing a historical novel? World War I, French and Indian War, and the 1950s in Pennsylvania. Is that maybe that's something for a larger conversation at some point? But you've obviously mastered the historical novel.
Well, readers these days, readers of historical novels really expect authenticity, and they look to see whether you know what you're talking about.
Mhm.
So when I wrote Both My Sons, which starts in 1713 Kraichgau region of Germany, in order to make this authentic, I had to go visit the Kraichgau. And then this Greenewalt, the main character, moves to the Peckway settlement in modern Lancaster County. So I had to visit the Peckway settlement. And then I had to think about, well, what kind of clothes did they wear? And one of the main characters is Janie Cameron, the Irish indentured servant of Greenewalt, who actually becomes the mother of his first child. Well, I had to investigate indentured servants in pre-revolutionary America. It took a lot of, and then I searched for journals on what it was, the French and Indian War. What was that like? And um, I even bought a book on 17th century slang, English slang, so that I could sprinkle my book with slang words from the 17th century. Sorry, I can't remember any of them right now, but uh, so anyway, yeah, readers demand authenticity. They should. Um,
And you have to know how to represent and present that authenticity in
exactly.
ways that are credible and readable, and at the same time make a good story, as you
Yeah.
you said, and they do make good stories. Well, listen, thank you, Ken. I'm going to turn this over to Richard Thomas. Again, I'll say, if those of you who maybe joined a little bit later, I'm sure many of you are already familiar with Richard in his roles as former superintendent of Lancaster Mennonite School and then as moderator of Mennonite Church USA. Um, and Richard, we'll turn it over to you and let you go at Ken.
Thank you. So it was interesting to hear Ken talk about growing up Mennonite in Lancaster County. I grew up Mennonite in Lancaster County. America was pretty high on my agenda, so was pledging the flag, but I was still Mennonite. But Ken's story really took me along in many, many ways. I could identify with it. One of my favorite authors or poets was Robert Frost. And he has this little poem. It's two verses. I'll just read the one. It says, I'm going out to fetch the little calf that's standing by the mother. It's so young, it totters when she licks it with her tongue. I shan't be going long. You come too. And I share that poem because as I read Ken's book, it was like, you come too. Come along, Dick, because this is the journey I was on. And there was so much that I could identify with, the growing up on the farm, the Jesus People movement in Lancaster County. Just
Wow.
lots, although I never went to that Lower Presbyterian or Octorara church, but I went to other things. And so there was so much that I think many of us can identify with in what you wrote. I was not like you in that I never went to a Mennonite school. I became Mennonite actually at Penn State with University Mennonite Church, which taught me a sort of generous orthodoxy, a generous embrace of difference and of people. The old joke at University Mennonite was there's not enough Mennonites in State College, so we couldn't split if we wanted to. We all have to hang together. And it was sort of where I learned something about keeping people in one group, whether or not they thought alike or not. Uh, after Penn State, I taught in the public school and then went to Lancaster Mennonite, where Ken, I was a dorm advisor for a while. I never
Oh,
lived in the dorm as a student, but I did live in the dorm as an advisor. And went on, spent a lot of leadership positions in Atlantic Coast Conference of the Mennonite Church, and then numbers of positions in Mennonite Church USA, spending a couple years as moderator of the denomination. Uh, those were interesting times. They were times where there was lots of discussion. There was lots of discussion around LGBTQ, lots of differences around that question. And as Ken, that becomes an important part of this book of his, is he part of the Mennonites or is he not? It became important where there were many people and many congregations that withdrew from the Mennonite Church USA because the Mennonite Church USA gave congregations the freedom to sort of make their own decision on the welcome embrace of LGBTQ Christians to whatever level the congregation wanted to do that. I spent a lot of my time, though, trying to get people that had differences to talk to each other, because it seemed to me that people were equally committed to Christ, equally committed to the church, equally committed to taking scripture seriously, but they came out on different sides. And so that I tried to work as a bridge builder to bring people to stay in dialogue, to stay in fellowship with each other, whether or not they agreed with each other. That's an important part of this book. And I think, Ken, maybe you want to talk about, discuss with us the role that played in your leading the Mennonite congregation in San Francisco, the whole LBGT question, and can persons of that persuasion be leaders? Can they be ordained? What about being members? And that was part of your struggle, I believe. Share that with us.
wow. I tremble because I know that very sincere people, very sincere Christians come out on different sides on this on issues like this. So my viewpoint is this is just my viewpoint. And if you have a different viewpoint, I respect that. Just like if you are still part of the Mennonite Church, and I know some of you are, um, and you didn't leave or didn't feel like you had to leave, like I did, I respect that too. I don't feel that that makes you less of a person or less integrity than I had. But anyway, Kathy and I came to San Francisco to help start a Mennonite church in the Haight-Ashbury. This was 1977. So it was long after the Summer of Love, 10 years later. But by that point, the former hippies and the drug had become druggies, and many of them, and ripped off and sold all the beautiful Victorian houses in the Haight-Ashbury for money, I guess. And so we saw a lot of stripped down buildings. But the Haight-Ashbury still, and is today, still a kind of a real, very interesting place, very culturally diverse place. It was the first place where I walked into a head shop. You you could buy whatever you wanted in the head shop. But anyway, our little church in the Haight-Ashbury, we thought we saw ourselves as being a Mennonite presence there. We were going to spread the Anabaptist vision, the vision of a peacemaking church. And we participated in the Haight Street Fair and had a booth where we sang songs like "Gonna Lay Down My Burdens Down by the Riverside, Ain't Gonna Study War No More." And the people who walked along Haight Street were fascinated by us. Most of them didn't come to our church, but a few did. But the original pastor left in 79 or 80. And the new pastor had a different viewpoint on what we should be doing as a Mennonite church. And she began by having sexuality studies, because it was such a hot topic in San Francisco. To address sexuality was a very relevant topic. If you want to be relevant, that was the way to do it. One way to do it. However, because of that, partly because of that, members of the congregation and the congregation itself began to identify with sort of, in my mind, San Francisco culture. And there was the feeling that, let's say, gay marriage is good. So we left. There were no other Mennonite congregations in Northern. So I felt like, I had two small sons, and I didn't want them to grow up feeling that this view of sexuality is okay. So we left. There were no other Mennonite congregations in Northern California at the time, so we joined the Presbyterians. And what's interesting is that 15 years later, the Presbyterians went through the same identical conversation. And our church was part of 1,000 Presbyterian churches that all left the Presbyterian Church USA over sexuality discussions and issues. And the way they framed it was a little different. They said, this is not a question about sexuality. This is a question about the authority of Scripture. You may agree or you may not agree with that. And I just want to also say here, Dick, that, I do not judge. I don't want to judge people who, let's say, someone who says that they are a gay Christian. I do not judge them. And this is something that I'm in my old age coming to. I'm becoming, I'm seeing this differently. And I found this line from C.S. Lewis, which I have here in the book. There, let me get the book cover. There it is. He said this. He said, we need to have a boundary on our capacity to judge others. And he wrote in Mere Christianity, ever since I served as an infantryman in the First World War, I have had a great dislike of people who, themselves at ease and safety, issue advice to men on the front line. As a result, I have a reluctance to say much about temptations to which I myself am not exposed. So I know what the Apostle Paul has to say about, let's say, homosexuality in the book of Romans. But so should a gay man live celibate then, or should gay Christians? I have no doubt that there are many gay Christians. So like I say, in my old age, I find that I do not have a public opinion on, let's say, something like same-sex marriage. I'm glad that Christians have opened up this can of worms because it's an important topic, and it's not a sign that our society is going to hell in a handbasket that we're talking about it. No, it's a sign that we're becoming more Christ-like when we can see that Christ attracts people that perhaps I might have written off as hopeless when I was growing up. So that's where I'm at on that, Dick.
So Ken, we've had numbers of conversations over the past few years, and I've come to respect you and to care about you. Obviously, I'm still in the Mennonite church, and I'm really happy to be there.
Good.
And you're not, but I think your story needs to be told because there's been just a lot of congregations have disassociated with Mennonite Church USA, mostly to be part of another Mennonite fellowship of churches that takes a bit of a different viewpoint, doesn't give the freedom the Mennonite Church USA does to congregations. And I also think that's a story that needs to be told because it's part of the Mennonite story as the Mennonite Church wrestled with this issue. And people that were in love with being Mennonite find themselves at another place now. But I also read a draft or two of this book before it reached the final stage. And during the way, I got the idea, Ken, that in some ways, you haven't completely left being Mennonite. Like, I'm not sure one can really leave behind something they were so much in love with, as you describe it as at one point. And I could talk a lot more about that, but I won't tonight because you're to talk and not me. So tell us about if you could, like, how does being Mennonite those years you were still impact who you are today, your life, your culture, your faith, who you are? Because I don't think you can completely divorce yourself from it. And as I read your writing, you haven't.
Okay. Well, there's a folks, let me give credit here where credit is due. The title for this book, which I've gotten a number of compliments on, Lover's Quarrel. This is Dick Thomas's idea. He said, why don't you call it Lover's Quarrel? I had some other exotic title for it before, but and I think I think it's a great title. So why is it a great title? It's from Robert Frost. Robert Frost said, I had a lover's quarrel with the world. Well, that implies a couple things. That implies that, you're not getting along with whoever you're talking about. In this case, it was the Mennonite church. But on the other hand, you love. I love the Mennonite church. I love the Mennonite people. I have, it's a cliche to say I have many friends who are Mennonites. I mean, that sounds like, whatever. But um, so it was heartbreaking for me to leave the Mennonite community, just really heartbreaking. I just thought I couldn't do it. I felt like I was ripping my soul out to do that. And so I identify with that. And if you recall in the book, I dedicate the book to people who have left the Mennonites for whatever reason. I say, perhaps the Mennonites hurt you, said things about you or your work or life or sexuality that made you mad or discourage you. For whatever reason, you're leaving for leaving. Your story deserves to be heard. And so I put my email address in there so people can write me. But and so some people may be offended by the fact that I call it a lover's quarrel. If they have also left the Mennonite church, maybe they are so mad they don't want to have anything to do with it anymore. But I pardon me, I recognize that, the Mennonites it's a great people. It's a great community. It's a great church. And I have nothing but respect for Mennonites, even though I'm not one. And would I join a Mennonite church today? I don't know. I'm not sure because I moved significantly in a number of things about my thinking. But and yet, so why write about the Mennonites then? Well, I always like to tell the story for those of you who know Marc Chagall, the famous Jewish painter. Marc Chagall grew up in what is now modern Belarus. Um, and during the Communist Revolution, he fled to Paris. But in Paris, all of his paintings are about his little shtetl, his little village back in Belarus, the little town of Vitebsk. And that very famous painting, of the man, the image of the fiddler standing on the roof and playing the fiddle, that's a Marc Chagall image. So why did Chagall do that? Because, we paint or write or talk about whatever is sort of dear to our hearts. And the Mennonite community is that's who I was. And so, yeah, maybe basically at heart, that's who I still am, even though I've been in California for 40 plus years. But everybody in California is from somewhere else. So what the world?
Hmm. Look, I know what I hear you saying is in a way that let me just test this. What I sort of think I hear you saying is that you still sort of love Mennonites, but in reality, as you've been away from at least official participation for these many years, your life sort of does change, and as path leads on to path, I think that's another poem. It's sort of hard to go back to a different place and take those all over again. And that would sort of describe sort of your feeling today that it's a lover's quarrel. You still love those people, but the paths have moved on that aren't likely to rejoin again at this point. And
No,
that's what I think I hear you say.
that's right.
So, Willard, I think it's time to move on to perhaps some questions from the group. I think that's sort of the conversation I wanted to have with Ken.
Well, you know what? The last time I looked here at the chat, I didn't see any questions in chat. So maybe people could just speak up, unmute themselves, and speak directly to Ken or Richard or I, whoever you wish to address.
Sure. Good way to handle it.
I have a question, Ken. Can you hear me?
Identify yourself though when you speak.
Arvid Martin. Ken and I were roommates our junior year at Lancaster Mennonite High School. I don't know if Ken remembers that or not.
Of course I do.
I just got your book today, and I got it about a half an hour before I had to leave to go to our little church here in Florida to do some work. So I haven't had a chance to really get into it too much. I read the preface and a couple comments you made about your feelings toward your dad and so forth. And Lorraine and I were talking at the dinner table tonight, and I said, when I was a kid growing up, I never identified to these discussions we had in our youth groups where kids were complaining about their relationships with their parents and this, the other thing. And I was just wondering, I came out of a more liberal background. I grew up in an Ohio Conference church. We didn't have quite the restrictions on dress and some of the other things that I came into contact with at Lancaster Mennonite. I was just wondering, what impact do you think that kind of a background has on people's adult impressions of Mennonitism?
Let me see if I understand your question correctly, Arvid. What you're asking, what effect does a conservative theology or practice have on family relationships or just on kind of on worldview generally?
Right, worldview, your view of the church. If you grew up in a home that was very strict, a lot of rules and regulations, does that make you less tolerant when you get older or not?
Interesting. My home was not, even though our church was very strict, my home was not very strict.
Okay.
And my father was, as you read the book, which I hope you do, you'll discover that my father was the storyteller, and my mother was the more disciplinarian, if you will, and the business person, ran the family. To my great regret, I lost respect for my dad because and I detail that in the book. I felt like he was not a success as a man, that he was not able to provide for the family, and so my mother had to work extra hard. And I think my brothers don't see him that way. It's very interesting. They had, I think, much more respect for him than I did, and I regret that I was so such a hard ass, if you will.
Thanks.
Anyone else?
I've got a question. Oh, go ahead. See someone else.
Hello, Ken. I'm Carl Root. I've known you for 60 some years, right? Probably.
Yeah, something like that, Carl.
We took that hitchhiking trip to Oregon together.
We did. What a trip.
Many thousands, several thousand miles. And you were last in Goshen, I think, 10 years ago. Thank you for the very broad sweep that you've taken in your book, all the way from covering Japan, covering Lancaster County, Scottsdale, where I also worked with Dan Hertzler. You knew him very well. And so it was a real privilege to read your book, and thank you for the many hours you put into that. I have a question, whether I've thought about this many times. Is religion a uniting force in the world or a divisive force in the world? Which I think one can argue that both ways, maybe. What do you think about that?
Spoken like a true, Carl, you're a psychiatrist, right? Or you were.
I am, yes.
Spoken like a true mental health professional. Is religion a uniting or divisive force in the world? I think we'd have to say in many ways it's a divisive force. I mean, religion divides people. Faith divides people. Does that mean it's bad?
you think of the Sunni and the Shia in the Muslim world, and all the turmoil in the Christendom, as you've referred to, and so you have to wonder.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know how to answer that question, probably in a way that would satisfy you. Um, but I think we all have our particular worlds into which we are born, and you know, my uncle George used to, when we would have family reunions, he used to say, "Thank you, Lord," in the prayers. "Thank you, Lord. Our lines have fallen in pleasant places." He would quote the Psalms, and he would say, "I'm thankful that we were born here." And I always thought, well, that's ridiculous. I mean, how could we have been born anywhere else since we have these parents? But yeah, you know, my wife and I took a trip to India, and our guide was a very devout Hindu, and he was a member of the Hare Krishnas, actually. Modern Hare Krishnas don't run around with orange robes and a pigtail down their back and barefoot like the ones we saw on the streets in 25 years ago, but he's a Hare Krishna, Krishna consciousness, and I think about someone like that, and I think, you know, wow, um, what a interesting culture to grow up in. So what's my responsibility to him? Do I have a responsibility to him? Well, my responsibility to him is just to be his friend, I think. Do I have a responsibility to, you know, share Jesus with him or something like that? Uh, you know, I would have to earn the right to do that. I have not earned the right to do that with Suvarna in this case. And we have another friend who's a very good friend of ours who's Hindu, who lives, who calls me. He's more like a son to me than my own sons almost. He's just a really very dear person, but he's a very devout Hindu. Um, and So what I'm not coming across very clear here. I don't think, Carl. I'm not really answering your question very well. I think yes, religion is a divisive force, and yes, it's a very key part of life. The urge to worship a god is very deep within the heart of every human being.
Thanks.
Another question?
I'm not sure if I'm trying to formulate a question. This is Ted Lowen. Ken and I crossed paths at the Haight-Ashbury many years ago that Ken referenced here. And I think what really, I just wanted to make a comment about your book, Ken. It is such an authentic book. And
Oh, thank you.
I think in the way that you're answering these questions is authentic. And I think that what went through my mind as I was reading the book, not only I was easily connecting with it, but the title, very good title, I think, Lover's Quarrel. But I think can't most people, at least people I know, have their own lover's quarrel? You know, I mean, isn't that I don't know that many people that's just seamless, that life is seamless. And it seems that there are places along the way that are you negotiate, and I think that's what you were doing in the book. You didn't hold back. Thank you for doing that.
Sure.
I guess I don't have a question other than
I was waiting for the question, looking for the question in there.
Well, do you see your lover's quarrel as being that different from other people's lover's quarrels? I mean, do you see other people as having to negotiate those kind of things as well?
Of course. Everybody has to negotiate with their past. Everybody has to come to terms with their father and mother and the culture in which they grew up, I think. By the way, Ted, you should meet this other gentleman who's on the screen here, Lynn Kaufman. He lives in Sanger, and
Oh, really?
you live in Reedley. You guys should get to know each other.
We're neighbors.
You're neighbors.
Yeah. I would like to meet him.
Yeah.
Yeah, let me just comment. I follow up on that. I think the the power of the book and the authenticity of the book is, in fact, the struggle that many of us and many non-Mennonites, I'm sure, can also identify with in any Christian journey. It is, as Ken says, a testimony. And there's a broad audience that can relate to those struggles, no question.
I want to. There's another part of the book that really gripped me early on, was the way Ken so carefully gave the book a grounding in actual geography and history. I mean, I even learned how and why the Mennonites ended up in Lancaster County instead of near Harrisburg. They knew what was good soil.
Say your name.
Oh, my name is Dillman. And and you know, the history of background history he gave, that I really related to that. And in contrast to that, just about a week ago, I heard a lecture about Jane Austen and her book, Pride and Prejudice. And the speaker, PhD, Charlottesville, UVA, made the big point that this book, I think she meant intentionally, had no setting, time, and place. It just starts out, one day, so-and-so went and did such and such. And there's no place. You can't tell where you are. And I had tried to read that book, a couple times years ago, and I could not finish it. Now I know why. I have a high need for a sense of place.
Okay.
That book had it. Ken does.
Yeah, well,
Thank
it's interesting. Patricia and I talk about this because, she grew up in Manhattan Beach and she's a California girl, and she says, you have this sense, Ken, of rootedness and family. And the first time I took her to Pennsylvania, she met 100 of my cousins and relatives. 100. How overwhelming is that? And that is what kind of is true. It's very unique. I think it's very unique about Mennonite life, and I'm sure it's true of some other cultures as well. But this idea of knowing so many people, and there's some real advantages of that, because as a writer, because the Mennonite it's a small community, I was able to rub shoulders with people who could make a difference in getting published. And many people don't have that advantage. But there's a lot of, as I grew up, I felt there was a lot of disadvantage to it as well, because I felt this overwhelming pressure to be religious, to be, and I write about that in the book, that the evangelistic songs and the testimonies of people at Lancaster Mennonite School, where I went, just overwhelmed me, and just about, because I saw to me, what seemed like such a difference between what people would say about their religious lives and then how they would behave. Well, this was a boys' dormitory. What can you expect? But so it was kind of brutal, really, living in the boys' dormitory when I was 14. And so this whole sense of being, so there's some things that are attractive about a culture like that, and there's some things that are very unattractive. So when I went to Japan, I felt like I had shed all of that, and I was going to be a new man. I was going to be Japanese, and I spoke Japanese, and ran around in a yukata, and it was a great culture. But then when my father passed away, it just kind of stripped away that image that I had of myself, and I realized I'm not Japanese. Here's this Mennonite culture that I thought I buried, and it's come back to life to haunt me, and made me mad. But anyway, that's why part of this this segues into something that I just want to be sure and say, and that is that the book, I call the book my testimony for a reason. And when I write the book, I address it, in kind of the way that if you read the Psalms, you're familiar with this. The psalmists address God and they talk to him as if they're having a conversation with him. And I do that in the book. And this is not my original idea. I mean, the psalmist did it, but so did St. Augustine in his book, The Confessions. And I just love that book because Augustine feels like he wants to bare his soul. Now, I don't know whether you all as readers were attracted to that or repelled by that, but
Oh, attractive.
I felt like, I feel like it's my testimony. It's what I have to say. I want people to know this, and here's the wonderful fact right here, summed up in that scripture, Romans 5:8, that says, while I was still a sinner, Christ died for me. Well, what's that mean? That means that while, after 10 years, I had 10 years of just hating Christians, hating my culture, hating my background, uh, laughing at Christians, making fun of them, graffitiing the face of God. Okay. And, in the middle of all that, Christ spoke to me. And I am eternally grateful for that, Willard. I just feel I can't stop talking about it. I'm just really grateful. I hope it doesn't sound overly pious. I don't want to be
Well,
pious.
the story is very clear in the book.
Yeah.
Well, that moment stands out and defines things going forward
Okay.
in the rest of the story, I think. Well, listen, folks, we are at the point where we had agreed we would come to a conclusion. I think that if there's appetite for it, we can continue to have some of this conversation, but we did agree that it would be a 1 hour conversation. If you don't yet have the book, you can get it directly from Ken with a signed copy on his website, kenyoderreed.com. All one word, kenyoderreed.com. 2 R's, YODERREED. And Ken, I believe you said that all the copies would be autographed. That
if they buy it through my website, yes.
Yeah.
If they buy it through Amazon, no. And it'll be the same price either way. And you can also there will be a Kindle ebook. I thought that I'm sort of mad at Amazon Kindle right now because it's like working with this monstrous bureaucracy. And so the Kindle ebook is not available today. It should be available next week. And yes, I will autograph books and send them out. And again, I want to repeat, if anybody wants to set me up for some kind of a connection with your local book club or your anything at all, I would be just thrilled because writers want people to read their books.
Sure. Richard, would you have any comment you want to add?
Not really. I mean, I think it's been a good discussion, and I think we learned a lot about you, Ken. And I just appreciate too your honesty and the authenticity of which things came through both in the book and in the conversation this evening.
Yeah. Let me ask one final question that occurs to me. And of course, we appreciate everybody who's been here. Thank you for being part of this. And good night if you have to go. But I wanted to follow up on that last one. I neglected to mention, I grew up in northern New York. My father was a bishop in the conservative Amish Mennonite Conference. And we lived we ran a farm in a small Mennonite community in northern New York. And it was a component of that reality that we were in but not of. That always seemed to me to be a fundamental element of the Mennonite identity that certainly I carried forever and still do. We were small, we went to public school, we were all together with the rest of the community during the week, but we had our own place our own community. We were in but not of, and we really believed that. It seems to me that that last question was somehow tilted in that direction, that there was it wasn't just cultural, it was Christian. We understood that we were that way because we were Christians, which we didn't necessarily believe that the rest of the community was, in the same degree. And I just wanted to mention, that was a fundamental piece, it seemed to me, of what that, even in a small community, that identity was. Not like Lancaster County, where all your neighbors were Mennonites or Amish, but still, it was that in but not of. So, Ken, that's not meant as a question, but maybe any final comment you want to make.
Well, it'd be interesting to explore with you that your comment there that you felt that how did you say you were in but not of, and you sort of felt like, did you feel like you were more?
We were in the world but not of it.
Okay.
And that was a separation that we all carried.
Yeah. Well, that's
So
a biblical point of view.
yeah, exactly. I don't want to drag this on, of course, but it did occur to me in the light of that last mention. I think we have one. Let me see if I have one chat here. One new message. Oh, someone said that was able to buy the Kindle copy, same price as print. So that's out there.
Okay.
Okay.
So I want to,
Last word, Ken.
Yeah. So I want to give a special thank you here to Richard joining us tonight, and with his, this man is a master of dealing with conflict, and he has, led the Mennonite Church in dealing with this profound issue of people leaving because churches leaving over their take on what Scripture means. And I respect that highly, Dick, and also your years as an LMH professor, principal. Thank you very much for your comments tonight. And thanks to Willard, my old combine buddy from Kansas. And Willard, it's obvious that your English literature, American literature background, and you didn't talk at all about it. Willard is also a very accomplished writer, and he's written a lot about Mexican, the Mexican
Native
writer
American.
Octavio Paz.
Native American and Mexican American writers and
Right.
contemporary poets.
Pardon me?
And contemporary poets, some contemporary poets.
Contemporary poets, yeah. And so he's written very excellent books on that, and he's an accomplished writer. So thank you, Willard, for emceeing us tonight. So I'm going to stay on here for another 15 minutes. If anybody, because the fish is not yet cooking, and it will start cooking shortly. But I'll be here for another 15 minutes. Thank you all for joining us tonight. You're free to go if you want to, but if you want to stick around, ask a question, I'm here.
I might stick around just to listen.
All right. Nancy.
Hey, Ken, this is Levi Miller.
Yes, my friend.
Hello. Sure. From Scottsdale, half a century ago, a couple of years there. I enjoyed your book, especially your family relationships growing up, and then your whole Japanese experience, which we talked about a lot of things, but that really enjoyed that. Just a thought.
Thank you.
If you wrote this up to the mid 80s, I think, at about midlife, just as you were starting then your professional life and away from the voluntary service group there and the church. I was just wondering how it would what would be different about it if you would write it, if you'd include the last, what, the last 20 years or the last 25 years, or perhaps you've contemplated writing of those years too. So just that kind of a question of how it would look differently.
So, okay. Somebody asked me, is there going to be a Lover's Quarrel sequel? And
Well,
the
yes,
answer,
okay, Ken, if I could just say, hasn't there been an element of that as a Presbyterian Christian, that there is also kind of a discussion or a quarrel within that context?
I guess, yeah. But I don't think there's going to be a sequel, and I'll tell you why. It terrifies me, terrifies me to think about writing about the last years since the 80s. I can't write about family members who are living, not because they are terrible, but because, it's I just don't think I can do that. So I doubt if I will write any kind of a sequel. I doubt it, but I could be wrong. And so if I don't write that, what should I write? And or should I hang it up? I don't know. I don't know. I don't know if that answered your question, Levi, but
Yeah, sure, no, that's fine.
Had a Hirschberger here. I saw a couple people I knew on here that I haven't seen for a long time. I just wanted to make one comment about something Richard said earlier, and then Ken picked up a little bit later about how much, I've left the Mennonite church too. And so I think that those of us who do leave sort of find that it's a little bit like you can take the farm out of the boy, or you can take the boy off the farm, but you can't take the farm off the boy, or something like that. And I think those of us who have left the Mennonite church have probably experienced a lot of that too. That you can take us out of the Mennonite church and we wouldn't go back, but there's still a lot of it there. And I assume Ken feels a little bit that way. The book sounded a little bit like that. And
yeah, talk about where you ended up, Marita.
I ended up in ELCA Lutheran. So, yeah, that's kind of a whole different direction, and that's a whole different story. So,
And Marita has made her mark as a musician in the Lutheran community, leading a choir and leading bell ringers, right?
Yes, I was a full-time minister of music for about 15 years before I retired.
Okay, Ken, I'd like to hear you comment about Alice Lapp's remarks about language of the soul.
Okay. So Daniel is referring to the fact that after I published Mennonite Soldier, Alice Lapp, wife of John Lapp, the professor of history at Eastern Mennonite, Alice wrote a very good and perceptive review, which was published in, I think, Mennonite Weekly Review, which has become Anabaptist World. And in it, she had good words to say about the book, but she said, but I miss the language of the soul. And I hope in his next book that Reed will include the language of the soul. Well, that is an interesting comment. I thought a lot about that. And I thought, well, what is the language of the soul? And maybe some of you can help me with that. What is the language of the soul? I thought that probably so in the memoir, in Lover's Quarrel, I tried to include the language of the soul by taking three, as it were, three photos of each event. So I took this hitchhiking trip across the country with Carl Root, and and so what did I think and feel at the time? Then, what did I do? And then the second thing is, well, what did I think and feel about that? And then the third picture is, how do I think about that now, 40, 50 years later? And so this kind of internalizing about an experience is my take on what the language of the soul might be. And some of you have felt like I did include language of the soul in this book. I don't know. I'd like to hear from some of you. What do you think? Yeah,
I
what do you
felt
think the
like
language of the
I
soul is?
felt like you had the language of the soul in both my sons and in your memoir, especially that last chapter, chapter 25. I thought actually, when I looked at things later, I realized if someone doesn't like to read a long book, if you read Ken's prologue and then chapter 25, you will get the burden of his soul. But you'll miss a lot of good stuff.
I was going to say, are you telling people not to read the rest of the book?
No, I'm talking about people I know that don't like to read much.
Great. Good stuff.
Good evening. Well,
Hey,
evening
Lynn.
probably for many of you. My name is Lynn Kaufman. I live in Sanger, California, just kind of like down the line from Fremont, where Patricia and Ken live. And my background, I grew up Mennonite Brethren. My mother was Mennonite Brethren, and my father, Old Mennonite. So for sure, my salvation is secure. And but I had the opportunity to live with Ken back in 1972, and we talk about Ken as being an author, a husband, father. Ken is also a disciple maker, and I ended up back in the East Coast where my father lived, and as one, I would call myself a really kind of a broken young man, 22 years of age, busted up, and ended up on a farm of my aunt and uncle in Lancaster County and down towards Oxford. And soon after, I met Ken, and we moved in together, lived with him. At that time, I think he was uh, uh, not reviewing, but sharing his book, Mennonite Soldier, with others. And I think you were writing a book called Hot Souls, if I can remember. I don't know whatever happened with that book.
It became He Flew Too High.
I see. Okay. But again, I very simply want to express a word of appreciation for having gotten to know you back then. You were very much of a stabilizing force in my life, as were a number of people and a Mennonite church, Maple Grove, there in Atglen, I believe, which was just good for the heart and the soul. And so I do want to say thank you. And I know that you not only discipled me, but you discipled the woman that I introduced you to, that being Kathy, and the influence that you had in her life. And then even as you moved out here to California, and the many conversations that we have had as you were involved in the Presbyterian Church up in Milpitas, how you opened up both you and Patricia, how you opened up your hearts and home to many of different ethnic, cultural backgrounds for the purpose to be Jesus's hands and feet. And so I just want to recognize God's work in and through both of your lives. And
wow.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn.
Mm-hmm.
So many wonderful people.
And you made really great spaghetti. I can remember that.
I made it or Patricia made it?
No, you made it. No, this was back in the tunnel, the apartment or that trailer house that we
You know,
lived
we
in.
have an ongoing discussion, Patricia and I, because I am addicted to sugar and sugar in food. So I like hamburger, I like meatloaf, and I like sloppy joes and
Yeah.
all this kind of, sweet meat kind of stuff, which is very much a part of Lancaster culture. And so she advises me, no, 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 we don't eat that. So I have had to change my eating habits a little bit. But thank you for your kind comments, Lynn. Yeah. Lynn is Lynn and I have had a wonderful friendship, and he and Mary, his wife, are a pastoral couple. They were in Spain for how many years?
20.
Pardon me?
We were there for 20 years.
20 years in Spain, and then he came back and he pastored Spanish-speaking congregations in Fresno. So Lynn and Mary are an amazing couple, very dear to our hearts.
Ken, do you do anything these days with judo?
Judo?
Yes.
No, sorry.
Oh,
I went through judo and then came back, and I've always been a runner and cross country running and loved running, but then my knees gave out, and so then I went to swimming, and I swam for many years, but right now all I do is take our dog for a walk.
was judo part of your reaction over against Mennoniteness?
Over what? Sorry?
Over your against your part of your rebellion against Mennoniteness?
How would that be a rebellion?
What? What'd you say?
How do you see judo as being a rebellion against?
Well, it's not very non-resistant.
No, judo is non-resistant. Yeah, judo was developed by monks because they were confronting bad guys, and rather than hit them over the head or kill them or shoot them or whatever, defend themselves, they developed judo, which you can incapacitate the other person by using their force.
I'm remembering now, I have heard that judo was defensive, not offensive.
Yeah, I think so.
So you were a good Mennonite.
I think it's a very Mennonite sport. Okay, well, one more question if anybody has it. Thank you again, everybody, for joining us, and thank you for your good questions, and thank you for reading the book, and keep on keeping on. Thank you.
Take care.
All right. Good night.
Thank you, Ken.